I recently finished watching Too Old to Die Young, and I really liked it. I thought it was a really interesting show, so I thought I'd have a go at making a video about some of the thoughts I had while watching it. I had a quick look at the reviews, and it seems it's proved, unsurprisingly, very divisive. It seems like about half the critics like it and half think it's rubbish. Those who call it rubbish seem to be blaming the TV streaming age in which we live for giving an art house auteur such free rein over a series. They argue he's self-indulgently stretched a 2-hour so-so plot out to 13 hours, resulting in a too slow, pretentious bore fest. I disagree on all counts. I found it engaging from the opening shot and never boring. But on the other hand, I'm not surprised that so many people dislike it. It isn't easy viewing. It's very dark and fairly slow. The dialogue doesn't follow the typical rhythm with pregnant pauses, particularly from Miles Teller. Each scene really takes its time, with the camera slowly panning across the landscape or creeping slowly into a character's face. It's also tough work in terms of its serious themes and images, and it doesn't present a conventional narrative with a neat ending. So I do understand it's not everyone's cup of tea, but there are so many hundreds of other shows on Amazon Prime alone that can give you those conventional, snappy stories. So if you know that's more your flavour, go watch Jack Ryan or The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I'm actually not being flippant about that. Those are two shows I like. But if you're willing to set aside what you're used to in terms of pace, story expectation, and you're interested in atmosphere, imagery, ideas, and mood as much as plot, then Too Old to Die Young is worth a shot for you, I think. I'm not so interested in reviewing Too Old to Die Young, though. It's not the best show I've seen in the last few years, but it might be the strangest and the most thematically complex. So I am interested in trying to unpack some of the themes and some of the things I found most interesting throughout my watch. Too Old to Die Young is directed, of course, by Nicholas Winding Refn, who you might know for Drive, The Neon Demon, Only God Forgives, or his older Danish trilogy Pusher 1, 2 and 3. So he's known for films. This is his first foray into, as far as I know, into TV or episodic drama. This one, Too Old to Die Young, stars Miles Teller as an LA cop who's being pulled into organised crime. His performance is very reminiscent of film noir leads, though he's not as chatty even as Humphrey Bogart. And it feels very reminiscent of Ryan Gosling's performances in a couple of Refn's earlier movies, Drive and Only God Forgives. While we're on Gosling, a thing I found myself thinking, the strange connection these two actors have, Miles Teller and Ryan Gosling. Their filmographies are connected in a few ways without them ever having actually worked together, as far as I know. One connection is, as I mentioned, Nicholas Winding Refn. Gosling starred in Refn's Drive back in 2011 and Only God Forgives in 2013. Teller, of course, stars in this, with a performance very similar to those two Gosling performances. Teller's Martin Jones here is a cool, robot-like assassin, akin to Gosling's K, actually, in Blade Runner 2049, too. He's also as tough and quiet as Drive's protagonist. He stoically suffers, beating after beating, like Julian in Only God Forgives. But Martin is perhaps even a degree colder and darker than any of those characters. Their histories share another well-known director, Damien Chazelle. Miles Teller starred in Chazelle's fantastic Whiplash back in 2014 as a drummer at an intensely competitive music school. He was then due to star alongside Emma Watson in Chazelle's next movie, La La Land, which you might have heard of, in 2016. He was ultimately replaced, though, of course, by Ryan Gosling and Emma Watson by Emma Stone, apparently due to Teller seeking a higher fee than he was offered. He was reportedly offered about $4 million, but wanted a couple more. Teller's performance here isn't the only similarity to Refn's earlier work, like Only God Forgives and Drive, though. The character, the world, and the action in Too Old to Die Young have a lot in common with Refn's earlier works. In the pilot, we follow Teller's Martin Jones as he drives around LA. His face is like a blank canvas, exposed to many horrors and seemingly open to anything. Not judging, but accepting whatever colour is thrown onto it. He works as a cop, but has found himself brushing shoulders with US gangs and making enemies in the Mexican cartel. Like Gosling's lead in Drive, he resists this dark action at first, but only briefly, and when dragged into it, shows an aptitude that hints at a dark history, or even that he was born for this kind of violence. And that continues to be a real theme, the innateness of violence in man. As well as reference earlier work, Too Old to Die Young also reminded me a lot of David Lynch. There's a bit of Blue Velvet's concern with the horror hiding beneath the squeaky clean green grass and white picket fences of modern America. There's some of Mulholland Drive's eerie exploration of the loss of identity in the gloss of LA. But more than anything, this reminded me of 2017's Twin Peaks: The Return, David Lynch's series, which is probably my favourite show of the last few years. It's similarly atmospheric, dark, slow, with similar staccato dialogue. It's beautifully shot in a real world, but with hints of surrealism, unpredictable turns from moments of absurd comedy to brutal violence. Both shows also feature striking-looking men in main roles. But yeah, they're both Lynch and Refn or their casting agents seem to be able to find these particularly interesting-looking lead men who are almost too handsome, with features too sharp that their looks cross over into creepy. The first striking thing about Too Old to Die Young from the opening scene is the cinematography by Darius Khondji and Diego Garcia. It's just consistently striking and great. So much of Too Old to Die Young is set at night, with sparse artificial lighting, highlighting only single objects and only parts of characters. This is on theme too, as everyone here is a conflicting duality of surface versus interior lives, exposed versus hidden, good versus evil, light versus dark. The supernatural elements too in Too Old to Die Young are only touched on, but the neon lighting with its unnatural greens, pinks and reds paints faces to present these people as in turn beautiful but also alien, unreal, almost mechanical. But the striking look of this show isn't only due to the cinematographers, I'm sure. Set design and decoration by Jennifer Lucart and Sally Thornton is really effective too, to turn Albuquerque dive bars into caves with seemingly long histories. And this design has cartel mansions dripping with glorious and disturbing wealth and self-reverence. Art is prominent throughout Too Old to Die Young. Janie's home, for example, is littered with paintings and sculptures. Her father, Theo, played by William Baldwin, judges Martin's inability to evaluate this art. The images on the walls of Jesus' North American home are particularly striking. In his house, formerly his late mother's, hangs many images of her, their colours so bold and vital that they seem alive. This highlights the sense that Jesus' mother was larger than life and remains ever present and central in his world. The opening shot too of episode 1 is of a mural of a daytime Mexican landscape painted on a wall in LA. Again, despite being a simple painting, it's shot in such a way and so close that it feels alive. And when the camera pans to reveal we are in an LA street at night under light globes, it's a surprise and a striking contrast of images. The music throughout Too Old to Die Young is also really effective and adds a lot to the atmosphere. The score is by Cliff Martinez, who also scored Refn's Neon Demon and Drive. It pulses and buzzes electronically, like much of the lighting. A low rumble ramps up to sizzling shrieks as Martin enters darker and more dangerous settings. The plucking of tight strings appears only at moments of particularly high tension, while Martin creeps delicately along as if walking on a tightrope. Hallie Gross, too, an American writer, shares the writing credits with Refn for at least the final 2 episodes, and he credits her as being third of the team with him and Ed Brubaker for a lot of the creative decisions. But in these final 2 episodes in particular, the 2 female characters whose influence on the plot and on the other main characters was already central, but who were, in terms of dialogue, action and visibility, probably a bit less prominent than the 2 male leads, come to the fore in all these respects in these last 2 episodes. Many of the ideas that at first I thought subtext here soon became text. By that I mean things that seem to be allusions or metaphor, and that which was only hinted at became literal or became parts of the plot, or thoughts that I had became voiced by the characters. For example, just as I was thinking, gee, Miles Teller is swaggering around looking like Elvis, Theo calls him Elvis. And just as I was thinking, gee, Jesus has some other issues and Yuritsa looks a bit like his mother, their sexual role plays begin to explore that idea explicitly. Usually I tend to prefer shows that leave those kinds of interesting psychological ideas at the subtextual level, but fair enough here, the plot decided to develop those ideas and it did so in interesting ways. And one effect of blurring the line between subtext and text, unreal and real, and by Refn's use of strangely artificial lighting, sets and performances, one thing that achieves is a dreamy atmosphere, and it creates a world in which it is only a fine line separating fantasy and reality, separating memory of the past and experience of the present, separating unreal and real, artificial and natural. Pictures of Jesus' mother, Magdalena, on the walls seem to spring to life. Again, this is a thing that you observe and then a character mentions it. Jesus makes his fantasies and memories of his mother come to life through the dressing and role-playing of Yaritza mainly. Diana communes with aliens in a show that's otherwise realist. Another recurring motif, I think, throughout Too Old to Die Young is characters' methods of communication, and particularly non-verbal communication. Martin, in particular, spits a lot. So often our hero, Martin, simply observes. He's often observing strange or disturbing events, like in that opening scene we mentioned. We're given long close-ups of his face, begging the question, what is he thinking about all this? What's his judgment? Generally, though, we don't get an answer from him. We get a spit. And this perhaps is telling us that he has no words for this disgusting world, only more disgust. He chooses not to engage in communication, but rather to attempt to expel his inner feelings, just to throw them out. When Theo shows Martin his own life reflected back on the cinema screen in Theo's movie, he still has no more than a few words to say. It's all right. Theo responds to that with biting sarcasm. Always so articulate, Martin. Speaking of William Baldwin's Theo, he's a character who has interesting communication. He has a lot more to say, but also snorts and growls, hinting at a grotesqueness or some base animal nature stuck inside him, congesting and clogging him up. Theo's surface is a great success, wealthy, social, intelligent, but something monstrous is only just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over, but just kept at bay, manifesting itself as tics, grunts, growls and snorts that interrupt his smooth theatrical speeches. Theo and his home remind of Nicholas Winding Refn's most recent movie, The Neon Demon, which was an exploration of the monstrous competitiveness in the modelling industry. For Theo, everything, even a life, can be bought and sold, and everything, even his daughter, is a potential art object for his evaluation and pleasure. He says to Martin, man to man, she's a 10, right? So he's even, judging his daughter in these kind of objective and sexualizing ways. When we see Martin looking at a strange piece of art on Theo's wall, in our heads, we're asking, what does that mean? But Theo enters the frame and asks, what do you think that costs? Showing the way he values things in the world. And it's a way that Refn seems to be very critical of, like he was in The Neon Demon. There's this association between a preoccupation with displays of wealth and immorality that we saw in The Neon Demon and we see quite a bit here. We see it in Mexico too, with Miguel, who displays his status by wearing shiny boots, jewellery and slick dark clothes. By contrast, the down-to-earth police officer, Captain Cortez, who seeks to maintain peace with the cartel, and who seems to be not an evil man from what we see of him, dresses unglamorously. When Cortez seeks a binding handshake with Miguel by spitting in his hand, Miguel recoils, I will not shake that hand. Like Theo and Miguel, Jesus is sparkly clean on the surface, but underneath hides dark, dirty intentions. With Jesus' rise to power, his dress becomes increasingly extravagant as he seeks to retake and restore his mother's position high in the cartel. Increasing glamour and displays of wealth are associated with decreasing or deteriorating morality. Too Old to Die Young is decadent in a few ways. It's extravagant, dark, and seems to take pleasure in degeneracy and decay. But rather than simply being decadent itself, I think Too Old to Die Young is interested in the idea of decadence. In literary terms, decadence is a movement or genre concerned with exploring and finding pleasure in decay. Writers and characters in decadent literature were also often defined in terms of their prioritization of artifice over nature. This was a kind of central idea to particularly the French decadence. For example, in the French novel A Rebours, Against Nature or Against the Grain, often referred to as the Bible of the French decadence. The protagonist, Jean Desesseintes, is obsessed with filling his home with monstrous flowers ordered from all over the world. However, he takes particular pleasure in artificial flowers, so well constructed that they seem very real and very strange. For the decadents, the combination of the artificial and the natural was fascinating, especially when the artificial dominates nature in some way, for example, by successfully taking its place or suppressing nature. The French decadents toward the end of the 19th century were also interested in the idea of fin de siècle, the end of time or end of the world. At this time, soon after Darwin's publishing of On the Origin of Species in 1859, one of their concerns was that humanity might de-evolve. Many writers linked industrialization and the development of modern cities to the decay of the human species. They theorized, for example, that the higher achieving, smarter, stronger members of society, of humanity, might, because they tend to move to the bigger cities and prioritize work over family, might be more likely to get sick, less likely to have families and have offspring, and therefore over time might contribute to the sickening or the dumbing down of the species. Too Old to Die Young is decadent in most of these respects and explores many of these concerns of the 19th century French decadence. Too Old to Die Young's world is a very dark one, and there are a few suggestions that this is because they are at a transitory moment in evolution. There are all these hints that at least characters theorize that humans have repressed their nature for too long, and technology has overtaken morality, and civilization has been pushed to a point of collapse. Jesus, Vigo, and Diana each give dramatic speeches prophesying the end of the current civilization. Vigo speaks about a post-Copernican humanity no longer at the center of the universe and no longer a part of nature, but having dominated and transcended nature. This, to some extent, is his justification for violence. He says, as the world fractures, someone has to be there to protect innocence. Diana imagines an end of times in social and political terms, where the few rule over and oppress the many, where morality is a joke and chaos reigns. After which, she says, a new mutation will emerge. So again, a lot of this is framed in evolutionary terms, which is interesting. Jesus prophesies a more biblical end of times. And over time, he begins to imagine himself in the position of the Old Testament God. And the new world is a violent bloodbath over which he hopes to happily rule. Each of these hinted at biblical calamities like the plagues of Egypt, but also at concerns expressed elsewhere throughout human history, such as I say, the decadence concerns about fin de siècle and their concerns about the degeneration of the human species. Vigo's own face, too, depicts this nature versus artifice duality or dichotomy, with his one real eye and one artificial eye. He explains that one eye was shot out and that afterwards he came to see the world differently, as if he can now see both the natural and the unnatural perspectives, one through each eye. Vigo mentions that he died for 3 minutes after being shot and was revived, after which everything was clear to him. So Vigo is something of a ghost. He feels as if he's transcended normal human society and morality. Medical science has allowed him to deny his natural degeneration. He survived a gunshot to the head and now persists on dialysis. So Vigo is both alive and dead. He is both in society and outside of society, breaking its laws. He is nature and artifice, seeing and blind, good and evil. Actually, the eye is a recurring symbol in Refn's work, figuring prominently in the climax of The Neon Demon and in the climax of the Vigo-Mother relationship here. In both cases, an eye is consumed. Not sure exactly what this means, but it's clearly an image that Refn's interested in. And actually in the credits of each episode here, Refn's icons or symbols flash up. A tiger, an eye, a flower, a snake. But again, they're not real examples of these things, but glossy, shiny silver fakes. It's another instance of this decadent, artificial, natural combination. Almost every scene in Too Old to Die Young plays out this conflict between nature and artifice visually. The opening mural is a fake image of a real landscape presenting Mexico at daytime, but in USA at night. When we visit Martin's boss, Damien, it's often at night at the ice rink. So here we're given beautiful shots of the ice, which is natural but unnaturally maintained with temperature controlling technology, lit up but with artificial blue, green, pink and red lights. In Vigo's speech too, he frames the shift from ancient to modern humanity in terms of the former, ancient humanity gazing at the stars, real but unreachable, from the supposed centre of a small universe, and the latter, modern humanity, seeing above and beyond our world thanks to technology, thanks to being able to light our way now. He says, now the lights in our city stretch further than the stars in the sky. So light globes are like artificial stars, allowing us to live in the night and allowing us to be in nature, but also above and in defiance of nature. Our characters' faces, too, are often strikingly lit with these neon colours, fracturing them into parts. Martin's face in particular is often displayed in profile or in some other way that shows him as part light, part dark, part visible, part invisible, part alien or synthetic somehow. There's this strong sense that we're often only seeing part of him or part of his mind. As the mother the mother of a victim he interviews in episode 3 notes, people aren't who you think they are. Or maybe they are, but there's someone else too. Someone you don't get to see. Viggo's face, to some extent, tells his story of violence, recovery, change. But Martin's face is so often so blank. At key moments, at or during extreme events, the camera turns to him, but he reveals nothing. In that opening scene we mentioned, we're waiting for a comment from this police officer as he witnesses his partner leer and mistreat the driver they've pulled over. When he finally responds, it's not with a judgment, but a casual spit. As he watches one of his victims in the desert, in episode 5 I think it is, bound and digging in the red dirt, the camera pushes in slowly on his face. But again, it reveals nothing, and we can only wonder what he's thinking about the violence in front of him. He's told us before he feels nothing, even when murdering mothers whose guilt or innocence he hasn't confirmed. But these slow pushes in by the camera seem to beg us to ask, what's he feeling, what's he thinking? Too Old to Die Young does feel, a lot of the time, amoral or even nihilistic, in that our heroes, our so-called heroes, don't exhibit much in the way of morality, and society's institutions all seem corrupt. For example, the corrupt local police, the fascism-loving homicide squad.
Give me an A.
And the plot doesn't give us much to cheer for at all. Martin is, as we said, the blank face of this amoral world. But throughout the course of the show, perhaps thanks to the influence of Diana and Viggo on Martin, some value system seems to emerge, and for the audience to root for. And some guilt seems to bubble to the surface as we see him help an indebted man avoid capital punishment, and then requests of Damien, his mobster boss, that he be given only the worst guys to hunt down.
I want the worst guys you got.
Then later, when he loses himself in a moment of passion and kills someone not on that list, he can't just casually spit it out this time, but vomits, perhaps a sign of some awareness of the rot inside him. By contrast, Jesus' crimes become more and more extreme, but his reaction shows zero moral concern. Yaritza, though she stands supportively by Jesus' side as he tortures and murders, reveals when she goes off on her own that she has her own agenda that is informed by an ethic, even if a vengeful and brutal one. So it makes sense that she's ultimately positioned as a hero of sorts of the show. She has an ethos, at least, and we end with the suggestion that it will be joined and perhaps refined by the good influence of Diana and Viggo. So in a corrupt society, seemingly full of evil and chaos, the relative goodness of Diana and Viggo's murders is something to root for here, something to follow. However, I'm not sure the show itself is really rooting for anyone. Rather, it seems to be saying something more complex, more subtle about the disturbed relationships everywhere in society and the way some groups latch on to simplified interpretations of good and evil, strong and weak, native and invader, to justify their torture, kidnapping or fascism. Throughout Too Old to Die Young, violence and sex are disturbingly intertwined. Jesus' whip, Yaritza's gun, Jesus' dress for violence, often near naked. The brothers in episode 5, the way they dress and objectify, bury women. All of these things link sexuality and brutality. When the brother is asked, why he's done this to this woman, he says, you wouldn't understand. As if it's like a taste thing, some, disturbed, refined taste he has that is somehow above normal moral people. Jesus' rage is also tied up in feelings of love, lust, loss for his dead mother. His whip is both sex object and torture device. The biggest murder of the series has him dressed in his tiny, shiny underwear only, panting with pleasure. The extent to which characters connect violence with sexual pleasure is depicted as the extent of their evil, often. All of these characters are violent, but the fact that Diana is able to control and direct her violence, and it seems also important that she's able to control and direct her sexuality in a kind of safe way. These things demonstrate a morality that Jesus and many of the villains Martin hunts down lack. Where Theo hangs his art as a display of wealth, Diana's home, by contrast, and her behaviour there suggest genuine, private appreciation of art and music for its own sake. Where Theo, brothers in episode 5, the cartel, and Jesus express a distorted sexuality that impacts others, Diana's pleasure is private, simple, mechanical, effective. So if at one end, Jesus and the brothers mix their sexuality and their rage, and at the other end, Diana and Viggo keep them separate, Martin is perhaps somewhere in between. He is guilty of a sexual crime. He began seeing his girlfriend when she was underage, but his violence never seems motivated by or tied up in his sexuality in any way. Although she engages in fetish play, I'd say Yaritza is on the Diana end of the scale too. Her sexuality is kept aside from her violence, and in fact we don't know much about her sexuality at all. When she role plays with Jesus, it's all for his benefit, it seems, to satisfy his strange desires. She's often in control and seems to receive no pleasure. Her violence, too, is calm and controlled. So, like Diana and Viggo, her victims are targeted for moral reasons, and she's in control of her desires. So this is perhaps a bit of a messy video. I just wanted to get out some of the thoughts I had, some of the notes I took while watching this show. I think this is a show that's going under the radar. Doesn't seem to be very well promoted on Amazon Prime, here in Australia at least. I had to search for it to find it. It didn't come up in trending or anything. But I think it's really interesting. It's got a lot going on. As you can probably tell by how much I want to talk about it. I think one day I'll rewatch it. I just enjoyed it so much. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it's as good as, say, Twin Peaks: The Return, which I've compared it to, but I think it's got a lot of interesting stuff going on in it, and I think I can learn more from it by rewatching it, and it makes me pretty keen to see what Refn gets up to next.